Okay, and I am going to share our land acknowledgement. This is new for Metro Blooms. We want to start all of our public engagements this way, and it's really wonderful because we are here with Monarch Joint Venture today, and they provided funding to help make this land acknowledgement possible. We also partnered with Wakan Tipi Awanyagapi in creating our land acknowledgement. So I will read this now. The work of Metro Blooms takes place on the stolen homelands of the Dakota Ayote, Dakota Nation. The state of Minnesota, the United States government, and European white colonizers carried out genocide, ethnic cleansing, and forced removal of the Dakota in order to acquire land and wealth. The Iowa, Ho-Chunk, Anishinaabe, and other indigenous nations have called this region home, but the Dakota are the indigenous peoples of this land. Their origin stories are rooted deeply in this landscape. They have been and still are here, stewarding the land, plants, and waters. We all benefit from this labor and love. Our state's name, Minnesota, comes from the Dakota phrase Minnesota, which describes the turbid waters of the Minnesota River. Another Dakota interpretation is Minnesota, a phrase that translates to the land where the clear waters reflect the clouds. The waters and plants here have deep traditional, spiritual, and cultural significance to the indigenous peoples of this land. As an environmental organization, we have much to learn from Minnesota's indigenous communities about how we relate to each other and the earth. D Dakota Makoche, this is Dakota land. Metro Blooms is located on Dakota homelands and treaty territory. We are committed to understanding our participation in and ending our complicity in systems of oppression. Metro Blooms will take action to support Minnesota's indigenous communities, voices, and the land on which they reside.
Thank you, Jen, for starting us off in that way and sharing that. And thank you all for joining our community coffee chat this morning. We know there's a lot of other things happening in your day and want to say thank you for choosing to spend some of your first 30 minutes with us. We're so glad you're here. I'm Laura Shaw. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the executive director at Metro Blooms, where our mission is to partner with communities to create resilient landscapes and foster clean watersheds, embracing the values of equity and inclusion to solve environmental challenges. And today we're excited to share more about one of our favorite topics, which is pollinators. And we'll spend time sharing a bit about how you can be part of the change and help pollinators thrive, whether that's in your own yard, in a container planting on a balcony, in a shared green space in your neighborhood or park. And we've invited one of our partners, Monarch Joint Venture, to join us. And I'll introduce our guest speakers here in just a few moments. But before we do that, Metro Blooms, the organization, might be new to some of you. People come to us in a lot of different ways. And we wanted to share a video about our work and what we do just to get us started. Jen, we don't hear any sound, so you may need to reshare with sound.
One moment.
This is Riverside Plaza, the site you're seeing on the screen right now. I don't know if any of you participated in our Earth Month campaign, but we were raising funds for our community projects. And one of those projects was the work at Riverside Plaza in Minneapolis.
Okay, let me know if you can't hear it.
Thanks, Jen. I love that video. Oh, we're gonna play it again. So for a little bit more context about our work, Metro Blooms has a few different arms to it, which you saw in that video. We are a nonprofit, and Blue Thumb is the education program of Metro Blooms. And one of Blue Thumb's major initiatives is implementing the statewide Lawns to Legumes grant program, which supports all Minnesotans to plant for pollinators. Maybe some of you have participated in that or are hoping to. Applications are open now for the fall round. And we run a for-profit, a design build company that helps people plan and install native plantings and rain gardens at their residences or businesses, and also helps generate some financial support for Metro Bloom's nonprofit activities. If you take away one thing from learning all of these names, I hope it's that really all of our work happens together in a really holistic way. So all of this programming really comes together to support all Minnesotans to plant for pollinators and clean water. And today we're joined by one of our partners, Katie Lynn Puffer, who's the education manager and project coordinator for the Monarchs and More Educator Institute at Monarch Joint Venture, which is a nonprofit organization also that supports a national partnership of federal and state agencies, nonprofits, community groups, academic institutions, lots of different groups that are coming together to conserve monarch butterflies and other pollinators and their habitats. Katie Lynn has been an educator at museums, zoos, nature centers, park systems throughout her career, and most recently was the education program coordinator for the Monarch Lab. We'll also be hearing later from Jen Ellert, who is the vice president of Metro Bloom's Design and Build and one of our lead landscape designers. Katie Lynn, I'll pass it to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Laura. Can you all hear me okay? Perfect. Well, thanks for inviting me to join you all today. I'm super excited to be here. I've got 7 minutes to share a lot of information with you all. So Jennifer, if you want to move on to the next slide, we'll get started. So to kind of start us all off on the same foot, we'll talk about what are essentially pollinators are any animal that move pollen from one plant to another plant of the same species, which then allows that plant to produce seeds. Pollination is essential to the reproduction of all plants, but not all plants are pollinated by animals. Some are pollinated by wind, some are self-pollinated, but we see all sorts of different pollinators in our yards and gardens. And a lot of them are ones that you might not expect, things like flies and wasps and beetles and ants. I think when we think of pollinators, a lot of us think of bees and butterflies, and those are the more common pollinators and the more efficient ones in some cases, but pollinators can include mammals as well and birds. So things like bats and hummingbirds. Next slide. So pollinators are extremely important to the health of all of our ecosystems. 80% of plants rely on animals for pollination, and those plants then provide food for many other animals. And the pollinators themselves and the food are also the base of our entire food web, which can affect even the largest predators, especially us. If we didn't have pollinators, we wouldn't have most of the things that we tend to take for granted, including the kinds of food that we eat, like strawberries, coffee, chocolate, and of course the beauty of the state that we live in. The beautiful prairies around our state and the gardens that are around our lakes and our homes. Next slide. Some pollinators that you might see in your yards and gardens, obviously the monarch butterfly. Monarchs are our state butterfly, if you didn't know that. And monarchs are the center point around the Monarch Joint Venture's work. It's the flagship species that we use for pollinator conservation. You might also find the rusty patch bumblebee, which is an endangered species. We do have them here in Minnesota, particularly in the Twin Cities metro area. But more likely you might see things like moths if you know where to look, or maybe some tiny green metallic sweat bees, or if you're really lucky and have some great pollinator plants for hummingbirds, you could see some ruby-throated hummingbirds here in Minnesota, which is the only species of hummingbird we have here. But there's hundreds of species of native bees and butterflies that live in this place that we call home as well, that we need to share our land and our habitat with. So by creating good pollinator habitat, we can ensure that all of the creatures that we live with also have a home. You can go to the next slide, Jennifer. So what makes for good pollinator habitat? Essentially, you want to make sure that you're including both nectar and host plants. And that's not just flowers. Having grasses and trees can also, or shrubs can also provide good habitat. Things like oak trees are actually a really great host plant for a lot of different types of pollinators, particularly moths. I feel like moths are the overlooked pollinator because we don't see them very often. They fly at night most of the time. And a lot of the times those host plants are, yes, providing food for the larvae of these butterflies and moths, but those larvae are then food sources for things like native birds, songbirds, things that are migrating through. So you may not eventually see all of the pollinators, but you will see more birds in your yard as well. In addition to the plants, you want to try to leave some nesting areas for native bees and other animals. Things like stems, cutting them back to somewhere between 8 and 12 inches in the spring can provide, leaving the dead stems in the fall and then cutting the stems back in the spring can provide homes for native bees. The picture on the right here are some bees that, and I'm not great at identifying bees, unfortunately, but I get these bees in my yard every year because I cut back the stems, and that picture is from my yard from a few years ago. Those bees nest in the stems of the previous year's plants. You can see the pith down at the bottom. They dig it out and then lay their eggs in it and line it with food sources for their young. In addition to last year's stems, leaving dead leaves and sticks on the ground can provide homes for bumblebees. Bare ground can provide homes for native solitary bees, which tend to be non-aggressive. I know that's a myth that a lot of people hear, that ground nesting bees can be kind of mean. And of course, anything can be mean if they're very, very disturbed. But if you leave them alone, they're just out there for the flowers. So leaving some bare ground and some dead leaves and sticks can also provide homes for pollinators. It's not always about the flowers, although the flowers are important. And when you're thinking about flowers, you want to make sure that you have something blooming throughout the entire growing season here in Minnesota. So that can be April all the way up through early October. So having something in your yard blooming throughout that entire season can be very helpful, particularly early on. And we'll talk more about that in a second here. You can move on to the next slide, Jennifer. So some examples of pollinator habitat, and I borrowed a picture from Metro Blooms here on the bottom right. Some boulevard gardens can be a great place to add for those of you who live in, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and some other more urban areas. Planting habitat in your boulevard area between the sidewalk and the street can be a great way to add a small amount of space that can have a huge impact on pollinator populations. We are in the month of May. No Mow May is a thing. If you haven't heard of it, it's essentially not mowing your lawn for the month of May, if you can get away with it. I know not everybody can, but it's most important when you have things in your lawn that actually flower. If your lawn is just grass, it's not always as beneficial as, planting other types of native plants. But you can learn more about No Mow May in all sorts of areas, and we'll be sure to share some resources with you as well. Having things like bee lawns, which are planted with things like clover and other types of ground cover. Again, this photo on the bottom left is from my yard, which was not purposefully planted as a bee lawn, but still serves its purpose. There's lots of bees that pop up in the clover every summer in my yard. And then I wanted to mention pocket prairies as well. And I didn't have a good picture of a pocket prairie, but I put a picture of this, one of my favorite books by Phyllis Root, Plant a Pocket of Prairie. It talks about all the different types of organisms that can live in even just a small area of land, and shows how much of a big impact small spaces can have. And all of these small spaces and small things add up to provide more green space and pollinator habitat through creating pollinator corridors and connecting the landscape. We'll share some resources on pollinator corridors, but even when those corridors aren't, or those green spaces aren't directly connected, they're still having a big impact. So everything adds up, and we won't be able to protect pollinators and provide more habitat with pollinators until we can put more pollinator habitat in those small pockets of land that still exist throughout our lawns, our yards, our gardens. So we'll share more resources with you all too, but I'm happy to take questions after we're done hearing from Jennifer.
Thanks, Katie Lynn. Does my sound okay? Can you guys hear me? Just checking. Cool, thank you. Morning, everybody. It's nice to see you all here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about just how you can create some of these pockets of native plantings. Now that you've learned a lot about our native pollinators and all their many types, what does that look like if you're interested in putting something like that in your yard, your property, your balcony? So we're just going to talk about that really quickly this morning. I always enjoy starting with this image because it shows you the native roots of our, it shows you the root depth of our native plants. You know, in addition to providing habitat for pollinators, these native plants also support our ecosystem through their deep roots, as you can see here. Native prairie plants have roots that can extend, 5, 10, even 15 feet into the soil, as shown in this illustration. And those deep roots can help reduce compaction, add organic matter to the soil, all while the plants above the soil level are providing critical habitat. So it's for these many reasons that native plants are excellent choices for planting in a rain garden in order to clean and filter stormwater runoff and support pollinators. So there can really be a dual purpose there to some of our native plantings. If that's something that you have an opportunity to install, you can provide those pockets of habitat and help to clean runoff. And then creating those pockets really helps, create a broader pollinator corridor through our area that Katie Lynn was just speaking about. Next, please, Jennifer. I really enjoy this image because it's a small rain garden. It's probably about 10 by 15 feet. It's a great way to capture roof runoff. You can see in the image in the back of this image on the left, there's a downspout right there, and all this roof runoff flows into this sort of slightly lowered native planting. It's a small rain garden that can easily fit into an urban landscape. And we have so many resources on our Blue Thumb website, which I know we'll be putting in the chat for plantings such as this one and templates such as this one to make that really easy for you. This is a shade-loving native planting in a rain garden. So it's providing that habitat for pollinators above the soil. It's helping to infiltrate stormwater runoff into the soil. It's really providing a lot of ecosystem services. And one of the ways that we've laid out these planting templates is to show the bloom time of all the species in here so that you're providing those flowering resources that Katie Lynn was mentioning throughout the growing season. And you will see in our planting templates, I really appreciate, Katie Lynn, that you mentioned grasses and sedges and how critical those are. In a lot of our shade-loving templates, we have a lot of sedges, and a lot of our sunny templates, a lot of grasses, because they really are providing that habitat as well. So since these templates list that bloom time, that makes that plant selection as easy as possible for you. Thinking about what might be blooming in our gardens right now, we're just starting to see so much come up. The bloodroot in my yard and the hepatica have just finished blooming. So that was really lovely and always exciting. Bloodroot's one of the earliest blooming native species. Jacob's ladder is just getting ready to bloom. And then the bleeding hearts are currently blooming a lot. So it's really, really lovely to start seeing that progression of native flowers in our area and to watch that happen throughout the season. And it happens quick in the spring. It happens really, really fast. So it's something to keep an eye on. Next one, please, Jennifer. It's really important to note that new plantings do take some time and a little bit of care to establish and thrive. So in your interest in supporting pollinators, there's a little kind of little sweat that you need to put into your own gardens to get those established and established well, so that they're both going to provide that habitat and then also be resilient in our changing climate. this image is a new native rain garden planting on the left. That's our crew from a couple years ago. They had just planted this garden. All of this home's runoff goes onto their sidewalk, which they had cleverly shaped to drain the water right into this planting. And then the picture on the right is the same planting just over a year later. So this resident really diligently watered deeply, excuse me, to get these native species established during a drought year a couple of years ago. And that's something to note, is that native plantings, in order to get them really established and thriving in your yard, they do need that care. We really advise watering them deeply and less frequently to encourage those native roots to get deeper into the soil, rather than watering just a few minutes every day. That will help them be more resilient, have those 15, 10-foot deep roots in times of drought, so that they're not getting too dry. And then also pulling any weedy invasive species that creep in. And this is a great example of a really well-established, well cared for native plant. Next one, Jennifer. It's also important to note that you might not have access to a yard, and that's okay. You can still support native pollinators by creating native habitat in containers. This is something that we've been experimenting with even at our own office. We have a number of templates for these as well, so to make this as easy as possible for anyone who's interested in a couple of perennial container plantings. I know we all here in Minnesota really love to plant our containers and our pots every spring. Well, this can make things a little easier if you plant them with perennials. So that means that these are perennial native plants. They can stay in these containers all winter long. They come back next year, but there's a few things to consider with our cold Minnesota winters. If you plan on leaving your native plants in these containers all winter long, don't use a ceramic pot or a concrete pot. They're likely to kind of expand and crack in the winter. There are more new resin pots that are flexible, and they won't crack in the winter. So it's just something to keep in mind in our area. In this particular template, the prairie smoke and rattlesnake master are some of my absolute favorites. It's really a lovely native planting, and this one is for sun as well. And then finally, on our last slide, I just want to note, kind of going back to what Katie Lynn said about boulevard plantings, we really help to create these pockets of native plantings as part of our mission-focused work, to install native plantings in boulevard bioswales that capture stormwater runoff and provide critical habitat in underserved communities in the Twin Cities metro that generally have less access to gardening resources, green infrastructure, and native plants. If you're interested in this type of work, you may be wondering where to get all of these native plants. We'll be putting a link into the chat about native plant sales, and then again to all of these variety of templates for helping you establish that native habitat in your yard. Thank you. And I'll turn it back to you, Jen.
Thanks, Jen and Katie Lynn. Thank you to Monarch Joint Venture and Metro Bloom's Design and Build for sharing all the helpful information about the role pollinators play in our ecosystem and how to support them. Today's session was really focused on pollinator habitat and information for the do-it-yourself person, which is a big part of our Blue Thumb education program. And Jacqueline is dropping links in the chat to resources, lots of resources and plant templates online that you can find to help support this work too. And Metro Blooms also supports pollinators through our community engagement projects, and more of those are typically focused with communities experiencing environmental injustices. And for us, that's typically renters, low-income communities, and communities that are primarily people of color. And then our design build team partners on these projects and offers design, installation, and land care services for hire as well. So there's really something for everybody. We hope you learned more about our work today and are excited about our future moving forward. Jen is going to drop some more links in the chat, and then they'll also be shared in a follow-up email that you'll get along with a link to this recording of our chat today. So we will stick around for about 10 minutes. If you have specific questions, please use the chat function, and we can call on people, or you can unmute yourself and share your questions as well. So thank you again for joining us.
This is Frances Felix. Can you hear me? Okay. I have a question. I have a really poor lawn, especially after last summer and the heat of last summer. And I'm kind of wondering about the clover, planting clover. Is it possible to seed it without tearing up? Seed it right into the lawn. There are some bare patches and that sort of thing. I guess I don't know who can answer that, but
Hi, Fran. I can help answer that question for you.
okay.
This is Jen.
Okay.
Yeah, so yes, you can definitely see that directly into your lawn. And actually, I really feel like that's the best way to do it, especially if you have a pretty decent lawn. It's a lot of work to tear up any existing turf. It can be a lot of work and it can be kind of disruptive and difficult to establish. So I think that's a really nice way to do it. Is to essentially, we call that overseeding into your lawn. And I think you could overseed with a few different species. There's a lot of really great mixes out right now. And there's groups like Minnesota Native Landscapes and Twin Cities Seed that make like a bee lawn mix that's already mixed together. And so that has a little bit of that clover, but it has a few other species. You know, one of the things that we're really trying to promote is just adding a lot of diversity to your yard in one way or another, right? So not just turf grass, not just clover, but additional species, because then as we have a dry year or a wet year or one or the other, then something is going to do well. And so that's what that diversity is really helpful with. So those mixes, and once I'm done talking, I can grab a link and put it in the chat for you for those. They can be really helpful, and you can essentially just overseed them into whatever your existing lawn is right now. This is a pretty good time to seed. It's maybe even getting a little bit warm, so maybe a week or two ago is really good. But I had to.
It might be okay.
Yeah, I think it's fine. You know, I think if you've got bare patches, just go ahead and go for it. The key with getting any type of lawn seed established is to do the opposite of the watering technique I mentioned in the presentation. So lawn seed is a little different than getting plants established. And with lawn seed, you really, and this goes for bee lawn also, you really just need to water like 5 minutes in the morning and 5 minutes in the evening every day for about 2 weeks. You just don't want to let it dry out. So it's just different than getting plants that already have roots established. This is starting for seed. So just to make that clear. And those mixes are really nice because they have things like fescue in them and they really have a great mix. So that's what I would advise. I think that sounds like a great way to go.
Yeah, thank you. I do have another question. I'm sorry.
I think so. Yeah, I'm not the moderator. So
okay. I'm really interested in doing the boulevards. There's two on either side of the sidewalk. But you know, in my area, southeast Minneapolis, there's lots of places where people have done their whole yards. And at some point in the fall, it looks pretty terrible. And, you know, I mean, does the city say anything about that? Does the city and their inspectors talk about that at all? Or has anybody had problems with it?
well, so when it comes to boulevards specifically, there is a city ordinance that plantings should be below 30 inches in the boulevard and below 24 inches at the corners. That's just to preserve sight lines. So all the templates that we have on our Blue Thumb website for resources all have plantings that are appropriate for boulevards and meet that height requirement. I think that's the biggest thing that I will see in boulevards is more just that, you know, I think that there's lots of things to do, and I don't know that many people get like cited for having plants that are taller than 30 inches, but in general, we would recommend sticking with plants that are 30 inches or below, just for safety, because you want cars to see kids on the sidewalk, kids to see cars, you know, if they're vice versa, just so that's why the plantings are supposed to be that height. So yeah, I would check out some of those templates. I think they will be really helpful. I know that there's a ton of information in this chat to click on links. And I think actually Jacqueline may have, or someone may have posted one of those seed links that I mentioned earlier in the chat. So you can click on that as well.
And I see a question. Are there people, it's kind of hidden here in my chat thing, but about people to help with the hard work. At 81, I guess I can do some shoveling and that sort of thing, quite a bit of it, but boy, all of it would be very difficult.
Yeah, go ahead, Jen.
Yeah, I was just going to share that I mean, Jen is the expert here. She works for our design build team, but we do have a maintenance team, and you can reach out. We'll drop a link to our design build
Okay.
folks directly, but we do have people who can help with maintenance. Jen, I don't know if you want to share anything more there.
Just that in general, as Blue Thumb, we have a lot of great Blue Thumb partners who do so much of this work. So at bluethumb.org, there's the partner finder, and that is a great way to find partners in your area who can assist with projects, design, build, and others. There's so much great organizations and great companies doing work like this out there for sure.
Thank you.
Looks like we have a question about mulch. Jen, would that be something you could answer? I'm looking for triple shredded mulch, which was recommended, but having difficulty finding it, located in St. Cloud. Any recommendations?
Oh gosh, I am not super familiar with the St. Cloud area. I'm so sorry. One of the things I could say is that if you're looking for bagged mulch, then look for something that says, like, you can even get like shredded Western cedar. That's a really nice mulch. Cedar is a little bit more expensive, but it's generally shredded and fibrous. If you're looking for mulch, you just want something that looks more fibrous and not like chips. Chips will tend to move around, float away. They don't mat together as well to like really hold in moisture. And the reason mulch is helpful is with new plantings. So pollinators do need a little bit of bare ground here and there, but for new plantings, we recommend that mulch just to help reduce weed pressure and to help hold moisture in the soil, so that those new plantings can get established. But look for something that looks shredded and fibrous, and cedar is a nice choice.
Great. We also have a question about what native trees would you recommend? And are trees providing some of the early pollen of the season?
Katie Lynn, do you want to jump? Do you have any native trees that are your favorites?
I mean, my favorite trees are oak trees, but those don't have the same kinds of pollinators or flowers for pollinators. But yeah, native trees and shrubs are an early pollen and nectar source for pollinators. Things like choke cherries, service berries, even the apple trees, like the crab apple trees and things like that are in bloom right now, are providing from some nectar for native pollinators that are already out and moving around. The other thing that I'll mention, and I know we're talking about native plants, but things like lilacs are also an early nectar source. I know they're not native, and so are dandelions. I have tons of dandelions in my yard. But the dandelions are one of the first things to come up every year, and I've seen so many native bees on the dandelions as well. And I know that's not always something that people are able to have in their yard or want to have in their yard because they kind of take over. But even those non-native things are an option for the native pollinators. You just have to be careful that they're not overtaking all of the native plants that you want in your yard. But some of those early blooming nectar plants that Jennifer was mentioning earlier, like the bloodroot and the Jacob's ladder, even columbine will start blooming here in the next few weeks. What are some other things that I've seen? Wild ginger, which doesn't have a big flashy flower, but it's like a ground flower. That's a good one. Some of those early spring ephemerals are good sources for nectar, and they're nice to plant in what's usually a shady area because they bloom before the leaves come out on the trees. So you can plant them in areas that tend to be shadier during the summer, but get full sun before the leaves come out on the trees. But as far as like other trees go, look into some, depending on how tall you want them. Look into things like, excuse me, some service berries, choke cherries, things like that. Those can all be great options that are native to Minnesota.
Okay, we have 1 more minute left here, so I'm just gonna focus on this question because I think it will benefit everybody here. When is the right time to be cleaning up your garden? Is it now, Jen? Having waited on the fall, leaving the leaves, is now okay a time to start cleaning it up?
Yeah, I really appreciate asking that question. That's a great way to kind of end this. I'd say in general, the less you do to clean up your garden, the better. So let me preface it with that. Um, and then I would say second, if you really feel like, okay, I don't like this look, I feel like I need to clean it up, then wait as long as possible. We generally let people know to wait until they at least see like dandelions blooming in that area. That's a trigger that the soil temperatures have warmed up enough that many of our pollinators would emerge. There are pollinators emerging from the soil all season long, so it's not like it's not 100% guarantee. But if you feel like you really want to clean it up, then wait until dandelions are blooming, and that generally has happened just in the past week or so that we've seen that soil temps warm up. Oftentimes we'll say wait until like mid-May. We're a little bit early this year. Obviously, we've had a pretty warm winter and a warm spring. But when you do clean up, leave some leaves in your garden that don't pull all of those out. Don't cut your plants all the way to the ground like Katie Lynn's cup plant that was in her image. Leave those stalks so that they have hollow stems to be able to utilize for nesting habitat. So this is your permission to relax a little bit and not have to just work so hard to clean up your yard. Leave it a little bit messy, and that would be go a long way to supporting pollinators.
Thanks, everybody. Hope you have a
Thank you.
wonderful rest of your day. We will be having another one of these at 6:30 tonight. So if you have questions we weren't able to get to, we'll try to reach out to you individually, but feel free to join us again at 6:30. It's the same link, so it'll work twice.